Rasti, jasla dječjim, rasti i cvijetaj, zemljorani ljudi, i neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada. Mir tvojim lađama napuči i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem dita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem dita. sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome along. It is the afternoon at 2 p.m. exactly of the 19th of June 2024, and we are joining today with another live stream, this one that is going to be looking specifically at mostly the Labour Party manifesto, due to the fact that I did look at all of them, but the extent of this program would probably stretch to about 9 hours if I tried to do all of them. So we're going to be looking at the Labour Party manifesto today. We're going to be looking a little bit at the Reform Party in relation to their possible role in the near future, and going to be looking at the other party manifestos on Friday. And for the rest of this week, so for tomorrow, we have, of course, a special program that's going to be pre-recorded, which is going to be looking at Mr. Putin going to Pyongyang. So Putin's visit to the DPRK today, which has prompted a meltdown from various reactionary pro-imperialist media commentators who have declared that simultaneously the DPRK is a Stone Age autocracy run by a madman, and at the same time, it's a deadly threat that whereby if it joins together with the evil Putin's Russia, it will cause the immediate collapse of Western civilization. I'm hoping the latter is true, by the way. So, going to be looking at that specifically tomorrow. But it's important to note just at this stage that, of course, the Russians and the DPRK have signed a mutual defense agreement, it would seem, committing to each other to come to the defense of the other if it is attacked. So that's a huge step forward for DPRK security. Essentially, that rules out any attempt that the US might have been tempted to make to hurl the South Korean puppet regime at the DPRK, which I think the South Korean puppets would have lost. You take a look at the state of that society, that's not a society that can go out and fight a war. That's a society which is being slowly killed by colonization over many, many decades. But more on that tomorrow. So, moving then to examine or start to examine some various different pieces of news related to manifestos, coming from the biggest condemnation of bourgeois democracy you could find, which is, of course, a British general election. The Americans will soon be entering into this race with their condemnation of bourgeois democracy, whereby they will attempt to conduct a presidential election between a man who is already dead and a man who is dead from the nose upwards. I'll leave you to work out which is which. Or possibly they may be replacing the corpse with the grinning psychopathic form of a certain Hillary Rodham Clinton, if the latest rumours are to be believed. And if the Democratic Party decides to run her in a rematch against Trump, well, I can only assume that there is a faction within the American ruling class which is absolutely determined to deliver a Trump presidency, because there is no other reason you would run Hillary Clinton other than if you wanted to absolutely guarantee that Donald Trump would win, and win with a far bigger majority than he would have done otherwise. This is plainly a desperate and insane maneuver, and if there's even if this turns out to be true, it must mean that Michelle Obama said no to it. Basically didn't want the gig, and they didn't have enough dirt on her to force her into it. So here we are, and we will begin today by just making, again, at the risk of making myself a hostage to fortune, I'll begin with some electoral analysis. Now, if you examine the latest polls coming out of the general election here, the poll remains pretty consistent in terms of the lead that it shows the Labour Party as having. So if we go over to the poll, I'll just share the screen in a moment. So I'm going to be using the Politico poll for this one. And if you're listening to this on the audio, I'll include the link in the description box of this when it's uploaded on Patreon. But I'm just going to share the poll of polls with you on the screen now. So you should be able to see that. That's Politico's poll of polls, and you can see that essentially it's consistent. Labour down a percentage point from where they were a month or so ago. The Conservatives down 2 points. Reform up considerably, and I think that does indicate that they are getting a certain level of resonance. By the way, it should be pointed out that Farage is, as I've mentioned before, relentlessly promoted by the bourgeois press. If you compare the treatment that he gets with the treatment that, again, someone like Galloway gets, you can see where the bourgeoisie is favouring things. So this was the same 10 years ago with UKIP. Like the bourgeois press would spend all their time screaming about how UKIP were awful. Farage was the second coming of Oswald Mosley. This needed to be opposed. This was disgraceful. How dare anybody vote for this? And they did this week after week after week, year after year after year. And of course, to paraphrase Oscar Wilde, the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. Negative press coverage for an avowedly oppositional party, which is what UKIP were and what Reform are. And they are an avowedly oppositional, self-described anti-status quo party. And so if the political establishment, which the great majority of the population, not just the working class in Britain, but large sections of the petty bourgeoisie and even some sections of the lower end of the capitalists now loathe the political establishment. They loathe the institutions in Britain. I mean, some of the more reactionary people will still defend the monarchy and Church of England as an institution, but even reactionaries struggle to defend the Church of England now. They will probably say that it's gone too woke or something, but really the monarchy is the only institution which the avowed reactionaries will still try to defend, and even that's a struggle for them. So the institutions of British bourgeois political life are despised, and so if you're an oppositional or an avowed oppositional candidate or party, and you're being denounced constantly by institutions such as the press, politicians, the establishment media in this country, if you're being denounced by them round the clock, 24/7, and they're telling everybody how awful and evil you are, well, that's really great publicity. I mean, trust me, I've run for election before. I wish the local press where I was running would have denounced me round the clock 24/7. I would have quadrupled my vote. So all the coverage that Farage has got over the years, going back over 20 years now, it's only helped him. It's only helped him build his reputation as an outsider, a reputation which is not actually deserved, but it does have its impact. You see, Reform were running along about 10% for a long time, and then they've received a 3% bounce, according to this poll of polls, since Farage took over as leader again. He's always been hanging around in the background, but the dud known as Richard Tice has been disposed of, and now Reform are running at 15%. Now, I should mention at this stage, if you're not familiar with the British electoral system, because it is a first-past-the-post system and a constituency-based system, you can get 4 million odd votes and not come out with a single MP in this country. All depends how your votes are distributed. So Reform could get 15% and still not end up with a single MP. It is likely that they will get Farage in Clacton. Again, Clacton in the southeast of the country, I've been there a couple of times. Very deprived area in many respects. A lot of it's got some solid middle class and sort of petty bourgeois areas as well, but it's an area where Farage, with a strident anti-immigration message, can do well. So providing he runs a well-resourced, which I think he's got a well-resourced campaign down there, there's every chance that he could actually win. But don't be surprised if Reform get 15% or higher and only come out with one MP. That's just the way that the system actually works. So you can get a decent percentage of the vote and only come out with 0 or 1 or 2 MPs. And the Lib Dems still come out ahead of Reform. Because the putting things in pure percentages is a little bit deceptive, and that's deliberate. It's deliberately deceptive. I still stick with my overall prediction that I made back when the selection process began, which is that Labour will be the largest single party at the end of it, due to the fact that the Conservatives are uniquely disastrously despised, but it will not be the mega majority that shall we say, a large section of the ruling class wants Keir Starmer to have at his disposal. So I'm just going to stop sharing that screen now. Go back here. So if Reform do particularly well, though, and here we will go into the realm of predictability, or prediction, shall we say. If Reform do particularly well, and they are a mixed bag of, like, if you look at their manifesto, it is literally like if you have like a petty bourgeois uncle or something in this country, or relative in this country, who reads like the Daily Mail or the Daily Express, it's that, but in manifesto form. And so it has a certain resonance. So it, again, like, does a lot of tub thumping on the immigration thing. They'd be another, trust me on this one, they'd turn into Georgia Maloney if they ever got in, though, because the British bourgeois would present their demands to them saying, well, we need that Labour coming in, Nigel, so you better come up with something else. So this is the reason why Farage will never, again, there's talk of him having a run for having a running reform on a sort of an ambitious run to actually form a government. He'll never do that. Farage is a gadfly. He'll like being in Parliament, he'll like sounding off, he'll like making a lot of noise, but he's not going to lead anything, not anything serious anyway. What will happen with Reform is that if they do particularly well, and if they do take a significant number of seats off the Conservative Party, and that's by no means guaranteed, I should say that, but if they do get, say, more than 5 MPs in, and they get a sizable chunk of the vote, and the Conservatives are basically saved by the electoral system, then there'll be a lot of pressure inside the Conservative Party for a fundamental change. And this pressure's been there for quite some time. And I will explain just a little bit about where this originates. There started to be a divorce between certain elements in the petty bourgeoisie, and then later, even amongst the lower bourgeoisie, between them and the Conservative Party, really going back as far as the mid-80s. And this started to manifest itself in disputes over the European Union, where the lower bourgeois, the non-monopoly bourgeois in this country, which have been increasingly marginalized, they and the small capitalists, the genuine petty bourgeois in this country, started to turn on the Conservative Party at the end of the 80s, when the petty bourgeois champion, Margaret Thatcher, the woman who was very much one of them, was disposed of. I mean, she was disposed of essentially in a move done by British monopoly capital. They had no longer any use for her. They wanted a more reliable servant, because they wanted the British government to invest more heavily in the project for building a united Europe. And this is something that monopoly capital in Britain was very invested in for a long time, still is. And Thatcher, because she comes from the petty bourgeoisie, and her electoral base was the petty bourgeois and the lower bourgeois were very much what she came out of, she was expressing their point of view when that layer started to turn on the EU. And it was starting to turn on the EU because that layer, correctly from the point of view of their own interests, was seeing European integration as something which was going to be a threat to them. Something which is essentially going to aid the big guys, not the smaller capitalists or the petty bourgeois. And this causes the split in the Conservative Party, starting in the 90s. So this has taken a long time to fully manifest itself. And this is one of the reasons why they lost so disastrously in 1997. A lot of Conservative voters either voted for Sir James Goldsmith, if anybody remembers him, and his referendum party. You could tell the referendum party, which by the way is one of the sort of precursors to UKIP, was well funded because I remember them delivering a VHS tape of James Goldsmith ranting about the EU to, I think it was most homes in Britain. I remember we got one when I was a kid, which I thought was tremendously exciting. You're getting a VHS tape from some ranting old guy. Little did I know that was probably recorded on Sir James Goldsmith's ranch in Mexico. So, but again, like James Goldsmith and people like that were a kind of symbol of things to come, of the sort of disintegration within the bourgeois class itself, between the ultra top of the line bourgeois guys and the smaller capitalists, and the higher end bourgeois were very, again, as I said, very invested in European unity, very invested in retaining and extending the single market, very invested in having a unified Europe-wide labour pool to draw from. And of course, the enhanced power that they could exercise via EU-wide negotiated trade deals, particularly with African nations, Southeast Asian nations, and South American nations. What they found was that imperialism, as expressed via the EU, could deliver even more of a punch to oppressed nations than if the British were out there on their own. Which is, again, these are all reasons why the big bourgeois want us to go back into the EU. But the Conservative split comes from this, and it comes from the unification of Germany, the extension of the EU across Europe, the increasing distance between the lower bourgeois and petty bourgeois and the Conservative Party gets worse as more and more of these people vote UKIP in the later 90s, early 2000s, through to the mid 2000s. This ultimately provokes the EU referendum with results we're all familiar with. Now, this layer is not going home to the Conservative Party, no matter how many promises Rishi Sunak makes regarding taxation, regarding national service, or any other of these things. No, where they're flocking to now is reform. So this is the layer that is most attracted to reform at this stage. They also get a certain amount of working class votes too, which is important to mention, as UKIP did as well. So reform likely to do well, at least in terms of voter numbers. In terms of MPs, they might not do as well. But it will increase the pressure within the Conservative Party for a new alignment of reactionary forces in Britain. And I say avowedly reactionary forces, let's put it that way. Because again, the UKIP, Freudian slip there, the Reform Manifesto has things like doing away with the BBC, their usual obsession with either scrapping or heavily restricting inheritance tax, privatizing the NHS, basically, though they don't come out and fully say that. They realize that would be a very, very unpopular thing to actually say, but that is what they mean. And other things such as, of course, making sure that Brexit is secured, a lot of posturing and tub thumping about immigration, which I don't think would ever manifest itself, even if they got into government, into a fully worked out program. Because again, they'd be given orders by the bourgeoisie, and none of these people, for all their bitching and moaning about the bourgeoisie, the lower bourgeois and petty bourgeois are not capable of sustaining a real revolt against them. They're capable of starting one, but again, the Brexit only happened because significant numbers of the working class went out and voted for it. The petty bourgeois and small bourgeois have been moaning about the EU for absolutely years, and have been getting around about a third of the vote in their favour in the opinion polls for leaving the EU. It's about a third for a long time. It only really started to change when significant numbers of the working class went over to the Brexit side arguably after 2010 that started to happen as life started to get objectively worse, and people were looking for a way to kick out against that, and the EU referendum was one of those ways. But to return to my potentially dangerous prediction, if Reform do well and the Tories perform badly, then there's going to be a lot of pressure from the lower bourgeois, especially, to realign the avowedly reactionary forces, which means possibly a collaboration or merger between the right wing of the Conservative Party and the Reform Party. I think that the momentum for that may become unstoppable. And so what you're seeing is, as the crisis in British capitalism intensifies, what you will come to see is that the political forces that have looked stable in Britain, in the bourgeois system here, for over 100 years, so that's the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, then they all start to disintegrate as well, as the voting base goes elsewhere, as all social classes, apart from the upper end bourgeois, start to realign. And so the Conservative and Reform parties, or the right wing of the Tories and the Reform Party, will probably merge in the near future, backed up by, again, some of the smaller capitalists, especially, but maybe some of the more reactionary or overtly reactionary bigger capitalists might go over to it. But you can then expect, I think, especially if Labour don't do as well as is predicted, then what Tony Blair initially wanted all the way back in 1997, which was what he called a merger of progressive forces, meaning he wanted, and this is chronicled in the autobiography of the former Liberal Party leader in this country, a guy called Paddy Ashdown, who, by the way, was a career-long MI6 asset, just like Keir Starmer, and Paul Mason, who we've got on the viewers list today. Welcome along, Paul. Hope you're learning something. So, back in the late 90s, and again, this is delving back into history, because you have to understand that what's coming to fruition now has been essentially bubbling away for a long time. There's been a pull by certain aspects of the big bourgeois in this country to finally dissolve the Labour Party and not get rid of the voting base it covers. But a lot of the bourgeois would like to completely and utterly remove even the sliver, and it is the tiniest sliver, of influence that organised labour does have. And I think that by this stage it's important to highlight that the amount of influence that organised labour has inside the Labour Party is negligible to zero. We'll get on to their manifesto about this in just a moment. So some of the bourgeois clearly wanted in 97 a less positive Labour Party result. So Blair got a massive majority in 1997, so he didn't need to go into coalition with the Liberals. But this is what Blair himself actually wanted. In the end, he couldn't do it because his majority was too big. And so with Starmer this time, the possibility is that if they don't get the requisite majority, if they end up the largest party but aren't able to form a solo government, they'll definitely look to the Liberals for a coalition. This will be very good for them. This would be what some of the bourgeois want. And they may even, if the Greens do particularly well, they may try to bring in the Greens, though I don't think that the bourgeois backers of Starmer would be too pleased about that. Not because the Greens pose any danger, but because they're a potentially destabilising influence. They'll be hoping that the Liberals get enough MPs to justify a coalition. If they do, then we will see a Labour-Liberal coalition, which will then look to probably merge with, if there's a collaboration between the right wing of the Tories and Reform, the left wing of the Tories and the Labour Party and the Liberals will all come together in this grand coalition. That is the future, and it's been coming for quite some time. The Labour Party, I don't think, can rely on the votes of the working class to deliver it majorities anymore. And so the bulk of the ruling class at this stage, and I do say that this is a shifting system, a shifting picture. The bulk of the ruling class want a unity of progressive forces as they see it. So they want the reliable parts of the Labour Party, which is almost all of it, the reliable parts of the Conservative Party, and the Liberals to come together into some sort of grand coalition, with ultimately a view to them merging and becoming one party in the future. Now, I think that's a delusional point of view, but it's one that is very much a political project which is got a lot of legs to it because so many in the ruling class want it to have a lot of legs to it. And you can, again, this is the cyclical nature of things that we're going through. When the end of the Cold War came, a lot in the bourgeois thought that, well, now we don't even need to pretend to pay any attention to organised labour anymore. We've won, fuck them. Let's reform a Liberal Party, which again, this is part of the reason why Blair wanted to do it. So this is taking us to the point where I'm now making predictions. So my prediction is Labour Liberal coalition, possibly with the Greens, but I don't think that will come off in the end. With ultimately, if the Tories do badly, the disintegration of the Conservative Party, its right wing breaking and merging with the Reform to create a new, more overtly and aggressively reactionary party, and the remaining bits of the Conservative Party, the Liberal bits, probably joining up with the Labour and Liberals to form some new grotesque organisation. And ultimately, this will lead to the ejection, I think, of organised labour from this coalition. Now, this won't happen straight away, but I think that this coalition, when it gets in, will be called upon, just as the Labour Party's historic task here is going to be to deliver a tax that on the working class, that the ruling class don't have faith in the Conservative Party being able to carry off. So if that means that they are doing those in collaboration with the Liberals, then that's going to put a lot of pressure on the relationship that the trade unions have with the Labour Party. There is a groundswell of anti-Labour opinion within the ranks of the trade union movement, and that is something that we need to exploit. And there are a number of us who are going to be trying to popularise the idea of disaffiliating from Labour, and that the political funds of the union shouldn't be squandered on this basically another party of capital, which is all it's been now. Well, it's all it's ever been, but the pretense has been dropped. So these are my rather hostage to fortune predictions that I'm making here. So now that is even before we get into the depth of the capitalist crisis that is currently rumbling away in the background. So we will now turn to an examination of some aspects of the Labour Party manifesto. So the manifesto itself is a bunch of nebulous bullshit. It contains an awful lot of god-awful management speak and the kind of things that are in there, like they're very familiar. If you've read a Labour Party manifesto after, say, 2005, and I've read for my sins, I've read the 2005 manifesto, the 2010 one, the 2015 one, 2017 one, 2019 one, and now this one. This one is incredibly similar to the 2015 Ed Miliband era manifesto, to the point where several passages from it might as well have been copied and pasted. So a lot of it is garbage. A lot of it has come straight from the think tanks of the ruling class. If you look at the kind of staff that Starmer employs and that he chooses to surround himself with, and the people who have the most influence over policy formation through the leader's office, a lot of them are former civil servants. People like Sue Gray, who led an inquiry into Boris Johnson that was essentially a senior civil service stitch-up to basically lever Johnson out of Downing Street because he was no longer regarded as a sound chap. He never really was. He was just a necessary evil for them. So Starmer is surrounded by like ultra-establishment types. Part of, I believe Sue Gray is his chief of staff. So again, career civil servant. If you're a career senior civil servant in Britain, it means you've got some kind of relationship with the security services. Starmer himself, I think it's pretty obvious by now, has a long-term relationship with the security services. So when you're reading stuff that comes from him, what it's coming from is basically like the permanent bureaucracy of the British state itself. Remember what we have said before about who actually makes decisions with regard to the government in this country. It's the senior civil service, it's the Bank of England, and it's the big interests who are represented via the City of London. Those are the people who actually make decisions in Britain. The politicians are just there to give you the illusion that some sort of democratic option is in place. Now, the great thing about Starmer is that he's such an obvious stooge of these interests that essentially this is them coming out into the open and almost running it themselves, just the same way that Sunak is. It's even more blatant with Starmer. Again, we will be doing the deep dive on the coup against Liz Truss next week, so please come back for that one. But when you're reading the Labour Party manifesto, then the reason why it sounds such bland nonsense is that you have to try and go behind the phrases to find the actual truth of what they're saying about what they're actually committing to. So I'm going to share the screen with you now, so you can see what I mean. So sharing the screen there, you can see that we are on the section entitled Making Work Pay, which is a real joke. Now, I'm highlighting this section because this is a classic example of the double speak that I've just been talking about, which is where they say a lot of progressive sounding things, but in actual fact, it's what they're outlining is a horror. So I'm going to read through this bit by bit and just point out what's really going on with this. So, making work pay, which by the way is a terrible phrase. I mean, if work doesn't pay at all, it is by definition slavery. So, but then again, if you look at some of the Labour Party's policies, you might be forgiven for thinking that they are rather in favour of slavery. So we'll go through this piece by piece. My first quote reads as follows from the first paragraph of this section. Greater in-work security, better pay and more autonomy in the workplace improve the lives of working people and bring substantial economic benefits. Britain's outdated employment laws are not fit for the modern economy, and recent Conservative legislation has fuelled hostility and confrontation, leading to the worst period in industrial relations since the 1980s. So, again, we have deception in the first paragraph. So, greater in-work security. We lost track of things there for a second. Hang on. Greater in-work security, better pay, and more autonomy in the workplace. Now, beware of deceptive phrasing. When people like this say more autonomy in the workplace, they are not referring to, believe it or not, worker control of industry. That's not on the cards here. Now, we are not suddenly finding that Keir Starmer has become a syndicalist or something. No. What they mean is more autonomy in the workplace refers to the fact that an awful lot of responsibilities have been individualized. The workers have been responsibilized, as they say. More autonomy in the workplace doesn't mean that you are given greater freedom. It means that you are given greater responsibilities to organize your own work. That's what that means. So, and this has been dressed up as empowerment. So one of the arguments that we used to get when we were arguing with, when I was a trade unionist, arguing with management about so-called flexible contracts, minimal hours contracting. So like they would try and employ people on like contracts for 3 months or contracts for 6 months. And we would always be arguing as the union for permanent employment. And the argument always came back, oh, well, people want more flexibility in a contract these days. People don't want to be tied down. They don't want to be tied to one company. They want to hop between contracts and hop between jobs. Of course, that's not true. But that's what the employer always used. And the argument about what they're saying about more autonomy in the workplace, again, that means essentially you're giving more responsibility and actually less freedom, and they call it autonomy. So what you find is that people in comparatively low paid positions get more and more responsibilities dumped on them, but with less reward and less of a chance of advancing to another level. What generally happens is those at the lower levels in most organizations now, public and private sector, get an endless amount of responsibilities dumped on them, to the point where there's a huge labor turnover in lower ranked places, especially in the public sector now. And they call this positive because it means that, oh, well, the workforce is just exercising its freedom. Truth be told, that the workforce is chronically overworked and underpaid, and so people keep moving between jobs at a record amount of time. So when they're talking about more autonomy in the workplace over the last few decades, well, this is again, it's a classic piece of misrepresentation. You've got more people have more responsibility. People are told to manage ever more of their own work arrangements. If you're working on an endless stream of so-called flexible contracts, you're often having to manage your work between various different apps on your phone. So autonomy in the workplace is a sort of classic post-1968 management speak piece of bullshit. Right, and they say that the British employment laws are outdated and not fit for the modern economy. Again, be wary of these terms, because on the face of it, because that sentence is joined up with the idea that the Labour Party is against conservative legislation on industrial relations. That's what that sentence leads you to think that they're saying. But if you delve into this, this is a comparatively short section, doesn't deal with a lot of issues, quite deliberately so. It's quite vague. You go into the actual Labour Party position, and what is their position on industrial relations? Well, are they, for instance, in favour of doing away with anti-trade union legislation that makes organising in the workplace more difficult, that makes running effective strikes more difficult? No, they're not in favour of that. We will go on to see what they are in favour of. So they make it look as if they're going to do something in favour of workers by the way that this is worded. But in actual fact, what they actually mean is the opposite. So they're saying it's outdated employment laws not fit for the modern economy. Well, what is the modern economy according to the Labour Party? Well, if you look elsewhere in the manifesto and also just look at the statements that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have made, their assessment of what the modern economy is pretty similar to what Rishi Sunak's assessment of it is. And Rishi Sunak's assessment of it is, of course, just a pure expression of the views of the ruling class, is that, well, the British economy now is all about tech, it's all about flexible working, it's all about basically ensuring that we have a high skill, maximum flexibility workforce, meaning a workforce with a lot of qualifications that he's never given a permanent contract. And that this has been the plan of the employers, and this has been the will of the employers, manifested through both political parties for years now. This idea that these ideas have been kicking around both Labour and Conservative for years, and they always disguise them with saying, "Oh, we need to update our employment laws," and what that always means is more flexibility for the employer, less flexibility for the worker. But again, they disguise this by attacking the Conservatives for creating hostility and confrontation. What they actually mean, though, is that they're going to make the employment laws even worse. Now we'll go on to see how, or a little bit of how. So, next section. For too many people, a job does not offer the route out of poverty. It should, either because work is insecure, inflexible, or low paid. Well, that's true, but the Labour Party aren't going to address that. Or because people face barriers when trying to move into a better job. Responsible businesses face being undercut when rights are not enforced properly. So, just to pause on that, work has not led to a route out of poverty in this country for millions of workers for decades, including when Labour were last in office. Now, we're going to go on to talk more about that in a moment, but the institutionalized poverty in this country, for not just for people who are long-term unemployed, but for people who are working full-time, that's been a growing factor in Britain since probably at least the mid-90s, arguably earlier. And we'll go on to talk about why that is in just a moment. But this idea that this is a new problem is not true. It was a problem when Labour were last in office. And why is that? It's because, of course, that they keep talking about, again, Labour does this, the Tories do this as well, talking about promoting good jobs, high-paid jobs. We are going to invest in manufacturing. They're all fucking going around at the moment wearing hard hats, as if these people have ever been near a building site in their lives, other than to, check in with their property portfolio. They keep talking about that, but the actual reality is that insecure, inflexible, and low-paid, insecure, inflexible for the worker, and low-paid work, those are the only sectors which have seen significant increases. That's the case both in Britain and in the United States. Biggest growth sectors over the last 20 to 30 years now has been low paid and insecure work. It has been agency work, temporary work. It's been work that's not done on permanent contracts. Those are those kind of insecure, hyper exploitable areas are the only real growth, significant growth areas in the job market. And that's not just true here. Again, true in the United States, true in France, true in Germany. What you have is more and more jobs in ultra low paid delivery jobs, service sector jobs on really terrible contracts with no union representation, no collective bargaining whatsoever. That's the growth industry. And this began all the way back under, well, originally under the Tories, but it really grew under the Labour Party. And it grew under the Labour Party between 1997 and 2010 because it was specifically encouraged. And it was encouraged by Labour Party policy over things like the minimum wage and by tax credits, by the usage of tax credits. Now, the usage of tax credits in particular was it was described as some great egalitarian enterprise. What it actually was the government subsidizing the wages of low-paid, often retail sector workers, so that the employers didn't have to pay even enough that somebody could live on, because the government would step in and make up the wages via tax credits. And again, that's been something which has been a policy of the Labour Party for over 3 decades now. And it's a policy that Keir Starmer will continue. So, yeah, there's a lot, the low-paid, hyper-exploitative jobs are very common in this country now. And they were made more common under the Blair and Brown administration from 97 to 2010. Cameron and Osborne and later Boris Johnson come in and make the situation even worse. Keir Starmer is going to only add to and further what was done back in the 90s and 2000s, though. So there's not going to be a boom in high-paying jobs. There really isn't. Again, he's bullshitting here, assuming Starmer even knows what's in this manifesto. I doubt he's read it. So we now get the cliches. Next section. Labour will stop the chaos, doubtful, and turn the page. 2 cliches in 1 sentence. I hope you're all feeling honoured. To create a partnership between business and trade unions by implementing Labour's plan to make work pay. Wordy title. Delivering a new deal for working people in full, introducing legislation within 100 days. We will fully consult with businesses, workers, and civil society, that means NGOs, on how to put our plans into practice before legislation is passed. So they're going to introduce the legislation within 100 days and do a thorough and comprehensive consultation at the same time, and then get it passed within what? Less than a third of a year? Yeah, it's not a lot of consultation time, given that this apparently is some great overhaul, which means 2 things. First of all, it's not going to be a great overhaul. It's not going to be some great overturning of everything the Tories have done over the last 14 years. It's going to be institutionalizing a lot of what the Tories have done over the last 14 years, dressed up as, pro-worker stuff. And as to them fully consulting with unions, they're not going to do that. Look, the Unite Union, run by this sort of pathetic individual called Sharon Graham, have already protested that the rights that were discussed with the Labour Party leadership between them and Unite over low-paid, insecure contract workers and trying to improve their positions. A lot of that got dropped in between the discussion between the unions and the Labour Party leadership and this being turned into the manifesto. So again, like the unions have no way of actually forcing the Labour Party to do anything now. The only way a conceivable leverage they've got is by cutting off the money, and they keep saying they're not going to do that. So the consultation period will be phony. Most of the consultation will be business. You'll get some trade union general secretaries giving some testimony, which will be ignored, and that's the way it will go. Okay, now we get to the more deceptive language. This will include, says Keir Starmer, banning exploitative 0 hours contracts, ending fire and rehire, and introducing basic rights from day one to parental leave, sick pay, and protection from unfair dismissal. We will strengthen the collective voice of workers, including through their trade unions, and create a single enforcement body, they do love a bit of bureaucracy, to ensure employment rights are upheld. These changes will improve the lives of working people across the entire UK. So, deceptive language here. This will include banning exploitative 0 hours contracts. Note the usage of the term exploitative there. So, this is their way out. This is the employer's way out. The 0 hours contracts will remain, but what will be done is the employers will be asked to put a series of pieces of window dressing on them. So, they may do things like introduce, in theory, some more rights at work for those staff who are on 0 hours contracts. They may they may change it. So basically, when I was working first in retail 25 years ago, I was theoretically on a 3 hour contract. I ended up working 40 hours a week sometimes, and I never got overtime for any of that. That was just considered to be, well, you're just doing a bit extra. There was no overtime payments. There was no even time off in lieu or anything like that. And at the time, because I was like 18, I was thinking, this is great. I'm earning all this money. So they can put you on a 2 hour contract or a 3 hour contract or even a 1 hour contract and say, oh, well, it's not a 0 hours contract. So when they when they use words like exploitative 0 hours contracts there, that's weasel wording. So if you're in a negotiation and you saw that come in, you would have to immediately then ask a representative of the employers who handed you that document, well, can you explain to me what a non-exploitative 0 hours contract would look like? Because by definition, all 0 hours contracts are hyper-exploitative. So why put that word in there? They're putting that word in there to give them the wriggle room later on when they don't do away with them, but the 0 hours contracts get a load of window dressing put on them by some legislation or some voluntary act committed by the employers. So that's why that word is in there. It's to give them the get out clause to not do away with them. Oh, well, we've done away with the exploitative ones. Oh, we've changed it so it's not exploitative anymore. All these people now have a guaranteed 1 hour's work per week or something like that. Or all of them are now guaranteed shared parental leave from day one in employment. Of course, good luck claiming any of that. And that's where we get to the next point. We will, it says, introducing basic rights from day one to parental leave, sick pay, and protection from unfair dismissal. Okay, so how are you going to get any of this is the next question. And then they say, we will strengthen the collective voice of workers, including through their trade unions, and then create a single enforcement body to ensure employment rights are upheld. Okay, so the collective voice of workers, the only way that any of these rights that they've just talked about can actually be enforced is essentially via trade union organisation in the workplace, via organising enough workers to the point where you can actually lead them out on strike. That is the only real way of actually forcing employers to abide by any legislation. So you can have your bureaucratic entity, your single enforcement body to ensure employment rights are upheld. That's going to be, what that is going to be is a meaningless quango. Quango, by the way, is a horrible British term. It stands for quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisation. Essentially, they're arm's-length government bodies created by the Thatcher administration originally to essentially outsource civil service and public sector work to a body which is wholly funded by the government, but which is not formally speaking run by the government. It's an arm's length organisation. It's a deception. Now, good luck if you're a 0 hours or a limited hours contract worker, or you're an agency worker, and you're working for some dodgy agency, and you're not getting the parental leave or the sick pay, or think you've been unfairly dismissed. Good luck turning to the agency and saying, well, I'm going to call the government enforcement body. That's going to make a big lot of fucking difference, isn't it? They'll say, okay, fair enough, do it. That won't stop the denial of basic rights to anybody. It won't stop the unfair dismissals. It won't stop, they say they're going to get rid of fire and rehire. How are they going to do that? How? They're going to tell the employers they've been very naughty and they can't do that? Well, the employers employ the services of legal teams, or they have legal firms on retainer who will come in and find a way around this immediately. Oh, we didn't fire and rehire them because these jobs we've just hired this new group of workers into look completely different to the ones that were there before. Look, the title's changed. Again, this is, if I was being charitable, which I don't feel in the mood to be, at best what this is a horrifically naive bureaucrat's mindset. At worst, it's a series of bullshit initiatives which look good on paper to the untrained eye. But again, can we come back to the point about how do you force even this pathetic minimal amount of legislation? How would you force the associated rights that are supposedly now there for workers? How do you force the employers to abide by them? It's not going to be through ringing a helpline. It really isn't. So strengthen the collective voice of workers. Well, creating some enforcement body isn't going to do that. Just the same way that you may remember, if you're from Britain, that it was almost 20 years ago now, a bunch of Chinese migrant labourers died in a place called Morecambe Bay, which is in the northwest of England, where I come from. And they died because they were employed by some hyper-exploitative employer to pick cockles off the beach at Morecambe Bay. Now, Morecambe Bay, if you're familiar with it at all, is a place where not only does the tide come in rapidly, but it's also marked by areas which are, if I'm remembering this correctly, quicksand areas. So if you don't know your way around, it's quite a dangerous place to be. And given that the tide comes in quickly, and you've also got problems with quicksand, trying to get away is quite difficult. So a lot of these people drowned. And out of that, there was a scandal. So the government brought in what was called the Gangmaster Licensing Authority, because these people were working for, as it turned out, or working via the services of somebody who was described as a gangmaster, which sounds like just something straight out of Marx's Capital, or if you want to go fictional about it, out of Dickens. And this was supposed to eliminate hyper-exploitative employment practices. Of course it didn't. It was just a bureaucratic entity which filed reports which nobody acted upon. So the same will be true of this. Look, if the union relationship with the Labour Party was worthy of being upheld, then the one thing that you would expect them to get would be legislation that would make actually organising in the workplace easier. So that would mean getting rid of all restrictions on trade union organisation, getting rid of all restrictions on the right to strike, getting rid of all restrictions on secondary picketing and things like that. Because it is only through the organisation being strong enough at a workplace level where you get to the point where the workers are strongly organised enough and confident enough to actually walk out and hit the employer in the pocket or disrupt their operations enough that they have to negotiate. That's the only way that you get any of this stuff, even this minimal stuff, enforced. Now, they're specifically saying that they are not going to do that. Or in this, they're not mentioning it all, but they've ruled out over and over again repealing the anti-union legislation, even when Corbyn was in office. Remember him? Currently, he's doing vaudeville with Owen Jones. Even when Corbyn was there, the only thing that they were actually committing to in terms of employment legislation is is repealing the last but one set of anti-union legislation carried through by the Cameron administration. We've had more since then. So that the only one that Starmer committed to repealing was, I believe, the last one that was done by Theresa May and Boris Johnson, which was about ballot thresholds and various other things. So they're not going to remove any of the restrictions that were brought in the 80s or the 90s, which are embodied in a horribly worded piece of legislation called the Trade Union and Labour Relations Consolidation Act 1992, or TLURCA, which is the word, the acronym you can use for it. They're not even saying that they're going to do away or even amend that. And the truth is, of course, as you will know if you've watched this channel for a while, that the trade union leaders themselves have no interest in actually doing away with that. They're quite happy with all these restrictions being on organisation in the workplace. They're quite happy with the restrictions on strikes, because they don't want strikes that are led by the rank and file of the trade union movements either. They don't want workers organising to the point where they can actually challenge the authority of the employers. They certainly don't want workers to have autonomy in the workplace in the way that the Labour Party says in the opening, they are in favour of in the opening part of this section of their manifesto. So again, it's all meaningless. Like, some bureaucratic body is not going to give you the ability to enforce any rights at work. And again, this is reminiscent of tricks that they pulled under Blair and Brown back in the late 90s and early 2000s. And I'll come back to why in just a moment. But let's conclude this walk through this bit of horrific con artistry. So, final quote. Labour will also make the minimum wage, make sure the minimum wage is a genuine living wage. We will change the remit of the Independent Low Pay Commission, so for the first time it accounts for the cost of living, meaning it never did before. Labour will also remove the discriminatory age bands, which, by the way, they introduced, so all adults are entitled to the same minimum wage, delivering a pay rise to hundreds of thousands of workers across the UK. Because I just started working when they introduced the minimum wage, and like when I was 17, we were excluded from it. So we were getting, like, this is a long time ago now, like £2.50 an hour. And the person next to me doing the same job was on, like, I think it was it £4.75 or something like that? So they were the ones that introduced the minimum wage in the first place. They're the ones who actually introduced the age discriminatory bands. So they're doing away with something that's been there for nearly 30 years, which they introduced in the first place. But I digress. So again, what is their solution to poverty pay? First of all, let's address the question of whether the minimum wage actually does anything. Now, there is an argument that came from the trade union leaders that this was a great victory. It wasn't. Because what all that does is put a floor on the pay rate, hourly rates in this country, by which the government tells the employer, well, you can't go below that. Now, it was already the case that in most areas of the country, when the trade union movement was far stronger, could actually enforce things more, and not just enforce standards in areas where they had formal recognition agreements. Because back until the late 70s, because there was 13 million workers organised inside trade unions, even though these are all very flawed, compromised organisations by their very nature, and even at the best, they're only ever defensive. But it did mean that the general standards across the board were much higher, because there was a much higher level of union organisation across the whole country. Now, when they introduced the minimum, so what that meant was, it was actually quite rare that you were getting somewhere where pay was so bad that people couldn't even live off it. Certainly not people who were British nationals. Now, there was always areas where migrant labour was paid basically slave wages. So that's always been a problem. It's a problem that's got worse over time. But what the minimum wage actually is essentially, it's not a favour to the worker, it's a favour to the employer. Because the employer can now say, look, we pay the minimum wage. You can't bring any pressure on us to pay any more. We pay, and then when they pay, it was already the case, by the way, that George Osborne, the sort of ultra-reactionary Chancellor of the Exchequer under David Cameron, had already linked minimum wage to matching the so-called cost of living. So this is something which, to a certain extent, the Tories have already done. So this is the Labour Party manifesto offering this great new deal for workers. When it comes to pay, they're only offering something which the Tories have already started to do and which Rishi Sunak has committed to continuing. So this is a similar policy to what the Tories have. And as for, enforcing it via another so-called independent commission. So again, the British government is full of these supposedly independent bodies which issue reports which no one ever acts on. So again, the unions, if they were worth anything, should have just said to the Labour Party, if you tell you what, and I quote here my comrade Terry Eaton, who said this recently, and I think he put it quite well, where he said that what the union leaders should say, if they were worth anything, is that you can have back the minimum wage, you can repeal the minimum wage legislation, and in return, we'll have all laws and restrictions on trade union activity, all anti-union laws repealed. And in return, you can take back the minimum wage legislation. I can guarantee you that if that deal was offered, no employers would take it. Because the minimum wage is a weapon in the hands of the employers. It's not a win for the worker. Because what it went along with, all the way through the 90s and into the 2000s, when this was introduced in the late 90s, 99 I think it was, 98, 99, was it went alongside a decrease in the collective bargaining power of the trade union movement. Because what New Labour, as they call themselves back then, it's the same Labour Party, don't draw any distinctions between the pre and post Blair period, it was all just branding. What the Labour Party did back then was they introduced the minimum wage, they introduced various employment rights legislation that purported to increase the amount of rights you had at work, just as this shit we've just read through does that. But what it did was it kept all the restrictions on the ability of trade union organisation to actually properly organise in the workplace. So it, in theory, gave a lot of individual rights to people. And it says, we're going to increase the amount of rights that you can have to collective representation, meaning that what actually happened was you got an increase in the number of non-union worker organisations in workplaces, so like staff associations, which have very minimal power, almost no teeth whatsoever. It's just a collective organisation which, by legislation, the employer is duty-bound to consult with the designated workers' representatives. Doesn't say in all the employment legislation passed in the 90s and the 2000s by the Labour government, it always says not the trade union, but the recognised representative of the workers. So what that means is, it looks like they've given you something. In actual fact, they haven't given you anything. Because without collective organisation, without, at the very least, strong trade union organisation, all these supposedly additional rights that they gave you all the way, which the union leaders will tell you was this great age of reform. Well, I worked all the way through that period. I went to work initially for the first time in 98 when I was 16, worked all the way through that period. And the actual atmosphere in all the places I worked at got worse. And the actual rights you had at work and the strength of the ability of the workers to bargain with the employers, in every place I was in, private sector, public sector, it didn't matter, it all got worse in that time. Because the amount of actual power the union movement has was decreasing all the way through the period that the Labour Party were in office. Because they never moved anything seriously that would actually enable greater usage of union power, that would enable greater usage of collective bargaining, or the enhancement of collective bargaining, or the enhancement of the bargaining power of the working class as a whole, which could only be done by enabling greater organisation at a trade union level. None of that was done. What you got was this whole bunch of supposedly individual rights that you were getting at work, which you had most people didn't know they had them. And what are they going to do? They're going to ring ACAS, the arbitration service. They're going to ring this new body. They're going to ring the Independent Low Pay Commission and say, the employment agency I'm working for is not treating me fair. And they'll say, okay, we'll have an investigation into it. We'll come back to you in 3 to 6 months. Again, meaningless. again, it's designed to look as if they're doing something, whereas in actual fact, they are continuing all the trends that Rishi Sunak's Conservative Party and before him, Boris Johnson's, Liz Truss's, David Cameron's, Theresa May's, they are continuing the trend towards lowering the amount of actual rights that you have access to, and your ability to enforce them, because they're consistently lowering and continually attacking the power of the trade unions, and the trade union leaders are collaborating with this, as they always do, because they're quite happy to continue to police the working class on behalf of the employers. It's a good deal for them, and they'll bitch about it because they think that the Labour Party is not taking them seriously. So this is the point I wanted to highlight. It's all a deception. It's all a bunch of nice sounding words, which when it comes down to it, is essentially the same program as the Conservative Party has. Because without the ability to collectively organise, without the ability to enforce collective bargaining, then all of this is worth absolutely nothing in terms of the individual rights that the Labour Party is talking about delivering to the working class. Not that it says the word class too often. Right. So we'll now pause. Thanks to all 241 of you who are watching at the moment. We'll now pause for questions and comments. Just taking the customary blast of tea there. All right. Okay. So I see we've got a fair few of you coming in today. Right. We have Banana Benders with us, who says, "Come on, Scotland." I think you're out of luck there, mate. If you're not familiar with what's going on at the moment, if you're from the non-European countries, of the European Football Championships on at the moment, a grotesque spectacle of corporate sponsorship, greed, short-sightedness, stupidity, and video assistant referees. I'm thoroughly enjoying it, by the way. Svetlana joins us from Moscow. Good to see you here. Ben joins us from Hungary and says, someone wrote into our show saying Farage is the new king of England. Yeah, well, I've covered the Reform Party, and yeah, again, this is Farage is promoted. The Reform are promoted because, again, they're going to be the new opposition. And if the opposition, the institutional opposition to what will end up being a sort of broad liberal alliance, I think, is essentially a rabid reactionary party, then that only helps the ruling class. Carmo, good afternoon to you. Tim Gray joins us and sounds rather pessimistic. Well, I understand your pessimism, comrade, but there's always room for hope. Robeson joins us from Jakarta. Jay joins us from the Commonwealth of Virginia. Richard is with us, as is Ross. Richard says, got my postal ballot this morning, most likely going to vote for Tusk. Well, be sure to read the programme and look at who the candidate is before you do so. Arnold joins us from Bridlington. Why are coastal towns in England so right-wing? Well, it depends on the town, really. I mean, I've never been to Bridlington, I must confess. I've been to Brighton. God knows I wouldn't want to go back there in a hurry. I'm just going to get, it's a bit of a cliche. There are a lot, I don't think there are any more reactionary people in the coastal areas than there are in the cities. It's just that, generally speaking, and again, I'm generalizing here, in the cities where there's a stronger workers' movement, there is a stronger, well, historically speaking, a more stronger, genuinely progressive point of view. I mean, progressive in the genuine, real sense, not in the fake sense that you get it now. A lot of coastal towns don't have an enormous amount of working class organization in them. Some do, like some of the port towns have got like fairly strong union branches that cover like the docks on them, but a lot of them, places like Bridlington, I'm fairly certain doesn't have much of a union presence, doesn't have much of an organized working class presence, and the only active people in places like that for a long time, and again, this is a fault of the left principally, have been right-wing organizations. bourgeois organizations. And so the propaganda of the bourgeoisie in these places has never really been challenged. And so it can appear to be incredibly right-wing because they're the only ones who have ever been active there. And if there's no workers' movement to speak of there, then again, reactionary forces have a clear run at it. Hello to C. Bolt. Hello to Jerry from sunny Hampshire. Lee joins us, as does David from West Yorkshire. Grassy Knoll is with us. Sean joins us from the coast of Cornwall. Svetlana says 29,000 US troops stationed in South Korea, apparently. Yep, I'm pretty sure that the DPRK will be getting some very interesting gifts from the Russians soon, which will essentially make any US attack or South Korean attack on the DPRK suicidal to the point of not being possible. More on that tomorrow. Tom Jode is with us, as is James Goblin, who joins us from Belgrade, Yugoslavia, the once and future Yugoslavia, I believe. Ben agrees and says Farage is pushed enormously by the media. That's very true. AJ Williamson says, following on from that all publicity is good publicity. Very true. Tom Jode says, Farage is dangerous. He sells himself as a radical instead of the outright fascist he really is. I mean, Farage is essentially just the kind of... He's exactly who would have been a Tory backbencher 40 years ago. The fact that he's not just speaks to, again, the class alignment that I spoke of, which started to fracture with the Tories 30 years ago and go off with Farage and other forces. He's dangerous in the sense that he's portrayed as an outsider when in actual fact he's very much not. As to whether he qualifies as a fascist, I mean, I would say that he's no more or no less of one than Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer's much more dangerous than Nigel Farage at the moment, as is Rishi Sunak. So he's no worse than either of them. Yeah, he's more openly reactionary on some issues, but again, he's no worse than the likes of Tony Blair. One of the disingenuous things, and I'm not saying that you, Tom, who've made this comment, that you're saying this, but I've heard this by a lot of leftists who, over the years, will, when it comes to the BNP or when it comes to Farage, and I had SWP people explicitly make this argument to me, was that Farage is the new fascism and therefore we must do anything we can to stop fascism, including voting Labour. Well, okay. And they made the same argument over the BNP, the actually avowedly fascist party that used to stand and had a couple of Euro MPs at one stage. They would always argue we need to vote Labour to stop these people. Well, the Labour Party 20 years ago was engaged in imperialist wars that were killing Iraqis and others by the thousands. Far more than damage was being done to colonised peoples than Nick Griffin could ever manage or Nigel Farage could ever manage. And yet you got these clown Trotskyites babbling on about how he got to vote Labour to stop fascism when the Labour Party is engaged in genocidal imperialist wars. So again, a lot of the left in this country have a huge blind spot over just how bad the bourgeois system actually is because it's an imperialist system. And they will throw an absolute fit over essentially questions of aesthetics. Like Nick Griffin is an open racist and an open fascist. Nigel Farage, well, he always dances around a little bit when challenged, but he's more prepared to indulge in racist language, for instance, and more prepared to be, well, I wouldn't even say he's that far apart in rhetoric from Labour and the Tories on immigration. He's about the same. He's prepared to go a little bit further. But like the dingbat left would even tell you to vote Conservative rather than vote for Nigel Farage because Nigel Farage was apparently beyond the pale. Again, he's barely that much barely different when it comes to the key issues. He's just a bit more crude in the way he expresses things. And for most of the left, the crudeness and the wish for nice aesthetics is really all the politics they've got to offer. Ben asks, who's the most evil lady in world politics? Hillary, Thatcher, Victoria Nuland, Krista Freeland, or Ursula? Also, who's the most stupid? Applebaum, Kamala, or Baerbock? Most evil? It's a very tough question. In terms of the one who's had the most influence, I mean, you're looking at a pretty consistent run of evil there. Hillary Clinton, I mean, the butcher of Libya, the woman who helped to restore slavery in Libya. Thatcher, well, we pretty well established everything that she did. I mean, in terms of the long career, Victoria Nuland's actually the one that's probably had the most impact because she's been around the longest. She was a long-term resident of the State Department for many decades. So she's probably the one that's actually done the most damage in the world, because the others are either appointed or elected officials who leave office after a while. Newland was part of the permanent state until recently, and so had more influence. She probably had more influence over the foreign policy of the United States than Hillary Clinton did, truth be told. Most stupid out of those three? Probably Kamala, but Baerbock's pretty damn dumb. Applebaum I never read anymore because she's always just screaming the same thing. Kamala's entertaining, though, because at least she's drunk most of the time. I mean, she's clearly, on a subconscious level, has made the correct decision that the vice presidency doesn't really matter and they're never going to allow her to be president, so she might as well just get pissed on expenses. It's like watching a drunken HR director delivering a Christmas dinner speech. Nigel Farage and the Reform Party, says Svetlana, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury and signifying nothing. Very good Macbeth quote there. I would say, I mean, it's a good usage of the quote. I slightly disagree in that it doesn't signify anything. It signifies a disintegration of the Tory party's electoral base, which is significant. If the Tory party bite it in the way I think they're going to, and the bourgeois has to reorganize their political forces in the way that I suspect they might have to, then that's very significant. But in terms of their the actual content of them, you're completely correct, which is that, again, they're another Maloney, they're another Marine Le Pen, which is that they'll strike all these poses, but then when it comes down to it, they'll end up looking like Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. That's why, and Nigel Farage knows that very well because he's not stupid. So he'll be out of there if there's a big reorganization, and it might not happen immediately. It might take a few years, but there's a new reorganization of the Reform and the right wing of the Conservative Party to create something new. He'll be out of there. He'll say, "I've created something new. I've broken the mold again. I gave us Brexit, etc. Now I'm off." Because he won't want to be associated with what that new party would end up doing. Svetlana says, didn't Thatcher privatise the British railway system? I spent literally hundreds of hours shivering on British railway stations listening to "We apologise for the delay." It started under her, it was completed under John Major, but yes, you are correct. Ironically enough, it's one of the few promises that Starmer has made that he might actually keep, which is to renationalise the railway system, because it's become too expensive and too embarrassing, even for the British bourgeoisie. They might have to actually have the Labour Party renationalise it. We'll see if it happens. They may have to, because still, a lot of people are dependent on train travel. It's still a very important method of transporting people around. So they need to make sure it's there and it works. And the private companies have deteriorated, and the government have allowed the relations with the unions to deteriorate to the point where there's been, continued and ongoing strikes, which, by the way, a certain Mr. Mick Lynch was happy to sell out. So it may be that the renationalisation does actually go ahead, if only because then they'll use collective national bargaining, or try and use it actually against the unions to try and enforce worse deals on a national level. We'll see how it works out. Ben is making the point that the US rail system is even worse. That's true. IRB Fenian says, can Galloway's WP have an impact on the Labour vote? It can. I mean, I'm going to be out supporting WPB candidates over the next couple of weeks. I've done one day, did one day yesterday, going to do another day tomorrow. I mean, the biggest problem that the WPB have is that they didn't have enough time to prepare. which is part of the reason why Sunak called the election early, to stop the erosion of the Tory and the Labour vote to independents, to forces that are slightly outside of the mainstream, not mainstream, but the traditional parties of the ruling class. So Galloway's WPB, it won't just take votes off Labour, it'll motivate some people to vote who might not have voted otherwise. The big problem that the WPB have is voter awareness and collectivized cynicism. And that's the bigger problem than hostility. It's that when you go around, I mean, as I have recently, Labour-controlled seats, there's very little actual enthusiasm for Labour that you run into. There's some. They're generally from the better off working class. There's some. But from the lower end working class, there's none. And the bigger problem that the WPB have is motivating a lot of the working class that's disengaged to go out there and vote. A lot of the lower paid working class has made the decision that the system will just try and fuck me over no matter what I do, so damn the whole thing. Not an incorrect analysis, to be fair. So they could have an impact. I'm going to withhold judgment on exactly what kind of impact they will have. It'll be something. I think we are going to see a significant vote for the WPB. I'm not going to predict how many seats they're going to win, though. As to whether it does a lot of damage to Labour, only time will tell on that one. Really, it'll vary also by constituency. Some WPB campaigns will have a lot of people working on them, others won't. I think we are going to see a few independents elected. I hope as many as possible to deny Labour an overall majority, but we'll have to see. Tim Gray says, I suspect Labour will win a big majority. I'm not so sure. However, looking at their programme, this could be the moment that breaks them for good as attack the working class with austerity and NHS privatisation. Yeah, they've been quite open about the fact that they're going to continue the privatisation of the NHS, but they were quite open about it 20 years ago as well. But the situation's got actually much worse now. So yes, Tim's point, you may be right. I think even if they got a big majority, it's going to be basically a poison chalice for them, because they'll use that to only make life objectively worse for the working class. And again, it will mean that next time they'll lose significantly. So we may be up like a rocket, down like a stick. I hope that we deny them that big majority that the ruling class clearly wants them to have, though. Rupert says, the memory of Paddy Ashdown's vile propaganda during the Yugoslav war still makes me feel ill. Indeed. Once an MI6 asset, always an MI6 asset. And he was colonial administrator for occupied Bosnia as well. A vile man, dressed up as a nice guy. Grassy Knoll says, largest private bus company in the US just filed for bankruptcy. Coach USA. Interesting. Thank you for the update. Good morning to Todd out in New Mexico. Harold says, Russian trains are so calming as well. I've gone from Kazan to Surgash and Surgash to Moscow. Both overnight from Kazan longer. That train rocks you to sleep. Well, I don't think you get rocked to sleep by a British train, unless, of course, it's derailed. And Grassy Knoll adds, Tupperware have closed the last US manufacturing plant and will move to Mexico. Don't worry, Trump will bring it back. It's fine. Well, Tim, you and I see things being different. I think that a lot of the Tories are becoming more and more reactionary. I think that one of two things will happen. Either bear in mind, the Tories almost split in 2015, and it was only the promise of the referendum which stopped a mass defection of apparently anything up to about 15 Tory MPs joining UKIP prior to the 2015 election. That's what caused Cameron to make that short-sighted decision. Tories now are polling a lower point than they ever have. And again, that isn't down to Labour being popular. It's down to them essentially being despised by a lot of their own voting base. And again, a lot of this depends upon how well Reform do. Bear in mind, these politicians and various other actors in the Conservative Party are very opportunistic creatures. The Tories will one of two things will happen. Either the most reactionary wing of the Conservatives breaks off and joins Reform, or Reform, if they get a significant parliamentary presence, will realign and join up with the Conservatives if the Tories go through a thoroughgoing process of essentially purging the entire David Cameron wing of the party. So essentially they would completely realign themselves as a more nakedly reactionary and more aggressively reactionary party, which will essentially move them into the territory that Reform's in anyway. So I think we are in for a process of splits and disintegration. Just depends how well Reform do as to what that realignment process looks like with regard to them and the Tories. But I can see a split coming along, because the ruling class, the people who matter anyway, aren't actually all that sentimental about their parties. They'll ditch one and form another if they need to. And if it means that the Tories can get revived by reabsorbing the energy that the reactionary petty bourgeois have within them, within Reform, then, and that can be harnessed into a new pure bourgeois party, an openly reactionary one, then they'll do that. And they will need a more nakedly reactionary party ready to take office once the Labour Party fails and falls to pieces. Starmer is a secret communist spy working for Putin. I read this in the Daily Mail, so it must be true. Well, again, that's you're referring to the Peter Hitchens story. Look, CJ on Twitter there is obviously joking, but this was Peter Hitchens. I think I mentioned this the other day, getting out ahead of a story about Starmer, which is that Czech intelligence recorded him as a British intelligence asset when he went there, supposedly on holiday in the mid-1980s. And so therefore, you get out ahead of the story and you essentially change the story by declaring that he was actually working for the Czechs. In actual fact, Starmer's been working for British intelligence probably since his undergraduate days. But again, classic way of redirecting the story. CRVS, good afternoon to you. Harold says moral autonomy means you have more of the legal burden placed upon you without being given any of the transfer information or power to fix what's wrong. That's very true. Tim Gray says, if you look at the higher education sector, you can see the model of what is going to be rolled out. Loads of managers, low-paid staff employed on temp contracts. We are moving to a universal system of day labourers. Yeah, that's what they mean by reform of the labour market. Now, what you will end up with, though, is all of those organisations that go that way, essentially barreling into collapse. Top-heavy, overly bureaucratized management structures that deliver fewer and fewer services. Next step is, of course, they collapse completely. And of course, I didn't even get into today, which we'll have to go into another day, the fact that the actual tax burden in this country, of course, has never been higher, and what people get for it has never been lower. So again, you're looking at a systemic crisis of authority rolling out across the state. When people are taxed in the way that they are at the moment, I'm not talking like the ultra-rich who, of course, evade it, but like the working class and certain sections of the petty bourgeoisie, you're looking at a crisis of confidence in the entire system. Again, no taxation without representation, to use an old phrase, which still applies. Like, if people are getting taxed to death and like are on already limited incomes and aren't seeing any improvement as a result of it, then that's crisis time for the system, which of course they will try and deflect by saying we should privatize more things. But the reason why you have these bloated bureaucracies now is partially because this is just the stage that we're in terms of the imperialist system always creates bloated bureaucracies to try and manage contradictions. But it's also because of the fact that in the Labour Party period, like a lot of policy was made by people who see bureaucracy as the answer to everything. If we like look at this, all the stuff I've just read out from that Labour Party manifesto, what it came down to was we're going to strengthen some bureaucracies and we're going to leave it at that, you know, and that's the way they view everything. So yes, we have a lot of bloated bureaucracies now. They're going to probably what's going to happen is a lot of those management types are going to be subjected to the same insecure employment conditions as the lower staff are now. They're not going to keep like management levels on like gigantic salaries for too long. That's going to go as well. Ben says in continental Europe, also called gig work, we call them box bikers, delivering food or passengers for one or the other. Yeah, that's the growth employment model in recent years. Moving through the comments here. I am Imsuved. I'm sorry if I've mangled your name there, or your code name. Please discuss proposals for the Council of the Nations and the Regions. Lack of trust in politicians is not solved by more politicians. Look, yeah, the devolution in Britain is a joke. It's essentially just a way of devolving responsibility for things, devolving responsibility often for doing bad things. So, like, we've got supposedly devolved powers to a certain extent in Manchester city region, Merseyside, Liverpool city region, North East as well. What they are is a way of essentially breaking up public sector structures, breaking up collective bargaining structures, trying to break things down to a regional level, and then putting regional politicians in charge of it and declaring the national politicians aren't responsible. That's all it is. I mean, it's a joke. I mean, we can go into the reasons why in future episodes if you want. But again, it's a way. It's not a way of. They say it's a way of devolving power. It's not, because most budgetary responsibility remains with the centre. What happens is that the regional devolved areas get handed an already cut budget, then get told to make it work. Basically, they might get told that they can, they can incur some more debt, perhaps. That might be something that they look at. But again, the centre retains the fiscal and monetary policy for itself. Jeremy Turner says, when Uber came rapidly and massively to New York City, there were a lot of suicides amongst taxi drivers and car service drivers. Still, it prevails. Yeah. I mean, Uber should have been banned because it is a system whereby the taxi drivers get fucked over, and the Uber drivers themselves can barely make ends meet anyway. Like, you get a job as an Uber driver, it's basically like get a way of you're barely paying for your car and your costs quite a lot of the time. So they should have banned it, but of course they won't. Grassy Knoll says the US prison labor system is a very large system in both the federal and state prison systems. That's very true. Jeremy Turner mentions the prisoners brought in to fight the wildfires in California who were paid in pennies. Yeah, that was one of Kamala Harris's wheezes, I believe, when in her more sober days. Sean says, these agencies pay a set wage and with no overtime, no holiday pay and no sickness pay. And to add to this, you have to be paid through a payment company. So there's two companies that are taking a cut. Yeah, the other thing to bear in mind about British capitalism is it's so parasitic that there's like a middleman in between the middlemen. So everybody's taking a cut of something. Yeah, and in terms of Sean says the building trade is bad for outsourcing. Everywhere is now. Building trade's I think it's been bad for it for much longer, but outsourcing and temp working and agency employment. It's the model for everything now, which is why they are desperately opposed, the Labour Party are, to increasing trade union rights. They need that flexible workforce, flexible in terms of it being always being bent into a shape that is required of it by the employers. Abtin says, 2 elections going on. Which one do you find the most interesting and why? The Iranian and the British one. Well, the Iranian one might turn out to have more long-term impact. In the British one, it doesn't really matter at this stage who wins in terms of policy outcomes. It's going to be roughly the same. I mean, I've only seen a few summaries of the Iranian one, but it might actually end up having more influence. It'll have more influence in the long term as to how Iran is run, because Iran is going to be more important to the new world order than Britain is, ultimately. As the American power recedes, so does British power. Svetlana says, Romanian footballers defeated the Ukrainians 3-0. Over the match, the Romanian fans were chanting, Putin, Putin, Russia, Russia. That's funny, and also it betrays a certain mood within the Romanian population. None of them are particularly keen to go and die for the glory of the US empire. Robert Monk said, enjoyed your commentary on political leaders in the UK, similar with Australian Labour, which is now pro-AUKUS US military. Yeah. Australian politics is a combination of the worst aspects of British politics and American politics, combined with the civility of a colonial government, a civility which has been transferred from being servile to Britain to servile to the United States. Inquiring Mind says, what do you know about free ports and special economic zones? I know that I'm going to be doing a program on them next week, so come back for that one. Basically, what the free ports and special economic zones in Britain are designed to supposedly promote investment by the private sector. Basically, it's where the government basically gives them various tax incentives and opt-outs from labour laws to quote-unquote invest. I'm going to be... I was looking over the details of this earlier on, and there's a whole plethora of things to get into on that. So, program coming up on that next week. Don't forget Epstein on Twitter says, thoughts on Collective and their candidate in Stratford and Bow. Are they enough is enough too? Yeah, they're a Trotskyite pro-Labour Party spoiler operation, both of them. The candidate in Stratford and Bow is, of course, Fiona Lally, who was, again, promoted heavily by the bourgeois press, I think specifically so she could run as a spoiler in the election. They've been caught up to all kinds of shenanigans trying to undermine the Workers' Party candidate in Stratford, Halima Khan. Collective and the various characters associated with them. And again, the association of people like Owen Jones with this gives away what it is. It is enough too. It's essentially an organisation which is nominally outside of the Labour Party, but in actual fact would lead back into the Labour Party if Starmer would give them enough concessions. So, very dubious organisation. It's the kind of organisation that will go back to Labour, like I said, if the slightest concession was made to them. Never trust anything that Owen Jones associates himself with, or any organisation. Svetlana says, Yulia Tymoshenko gets my vote for most evil woman in politics. Yeah, I mean, she's close. I mean, given what she's done with Ukraine, I mean, she's won her and her old compadre Viktor Yushchenko get some pretty heavy votes for the most evil bastard in Europe. The other one, of course, if we're talking women in politics, then we've got to mention Tikhanovskaya from Belarus, the woman who would be chief comprador, a woman who would reduce Belarus to slavery and basically turn it into a war zone on behalf of US imperialism. Kevin says, I resolved not to give Owen Jones any attention ever since he jumped on the anti-Semitism and Labour Party bandwagon. Same for Navarra Media. Arguably, the principal target of that assault was Corbyn, and now he's talking in public with one of his backstabbers. He's not just talking with him, he's campaigning with him. I mean, it does. I mean, Professor David Miller has said this, as have others, that they raised the point about, well, how much in control was Corbyn of his own leadership, given that this run that he's doing now seems to be largely being managed. I mean, admittedly, any run you do in an election campaign, a lot of it's going to be managed by other people. But Corbyn seems to sign over so much of his own campaign to these organisations like Collective and various characters associated with it, including some that call themselves Zionists openly. Therefore, you have to ask, well, how much of things was he really ever running when he was Labour Party leader? Given that he is desperate, it seems, to hand over control to anybody else who comes up with and presents him with a plan. So we have to, given how quickly he's willing to re-embrace a complete snake like Owen Jones, a man who defamed Corbyn. And I know his defenders will say, oh, he's a nice man, he wants to forgive people. Well, I'm not so sure. I think Corbyn understands his role pretty well, and he has done for quite some time. His role is to be another policeman of acceptable opinion. And yes, he's not allowed to do it in the Labour Party anymore, but the fact that he's hooking up with the likes of Owen Jones shows us that what he wants to be is to continue his role as an arbiter of acceptable opinion on the left. That's what he wants to be. And he's always been very keen in his role in the Stop the War Coalition to control what is acceptable to be said there, and I think he wants to retain that position. So Corbyn himself, not to be trusted. I mean, it's not, you can argue, oh, he made a mistake, he trusted the wrong people when he surrounded himself by people like John McDonnell, who's a man of obvious rat, a man who collaborates with the worst war criminals you can possibly find, a man who, if he's not on the payroll of the British Secret Services, then, well, he really should be. So when you surround yourself with those people over and over and over again, both in the Labour Party and outside of it, in the end you have to ask the question of, well, what's Corbyn really doing? And the answer comes back, well, what he's actually doing is that he's doing a job for imperialism. He's policing opinion. Mick Lynch was just on Navarra Media telling people to vote Labour. He's been telling people to vote Labour for years now. Zuleika asks, what did they say about the water? If you're not familiar, we've got a sewage leak problem in the water supply in this country. All they've said that I can see is that they'll get the situation under control. They'll toughen up on the regulations. Now, bear in mind, regulations over the water companies were crap when they were nationalised and have got worse since they were privatised. Unless they're going to do nationalisation and then an investment plan to essentially address the reason why the British water companies have dumped sewage either into rivers or onto beaches for decades, then nothing they say is worth anything. All they're talking about so far is tightening up regulations. What difference would nationalisation of the railways make under a Starmer government? Asks CJ on Twitter. My inclination is to say not a great deal. They would strive to make it as useless as possible, I'm sure. There's a possibility that collective bargaining improves under a single unified system, but again, I can't see them voluntarily improving the bargaining position of the RMT and ASLEF. I think they will try and undermine that however they can. So I think the Mick Lynch is selling his members a big dummy. There's going to be some way in which they they undermine any potential gain that our railway workers make via nationalisation. Ian Foster says Labour 35% of the vote tops. I think my comrade is correct there. They're estimating far over what they'll actually get. Devolution would be a good idea for a show, says Zuleika. It's a good point. I will make a note of that and put it on probably next week. Right. Condoleezza Rice in the running for most evil woman. That's true. And that's before we even get to all of her crimes. Right, okay, so I'm going to draw things to a close for today. Remember, special program tomorrow on the Putin visit to the DPRK. That'll be a pre-recorded one. And then we'll be back with anti-imperialism special on Friday, though I may do some rejigging, but that's the two programs over the next couple of days. We also have to fit in the next program in the Stalin series at some point soon. So thank you to all 275 of you who are watching at the moment. Thank you to everybody who supports the program on Patreon and on Buy Me a Coffee. Wouldn't be possible without your assistance. And I will return to you tomorrow. Thanks to everybody who's watched and has contributed to a very lively chat as always. And I will be back with you again tomorrow.
Никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут.